computer and is now recording. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first seminar for the 2024 academic year in the Beishida or Beijing Normal University at Zhuhai Philosophy Seminar Series. I am your convener, Associate Professor M.R.X. Dentith, and today I have the great pleasure to introduce a talk given by Will Mittendorf from Cerritos College in California, which is going to be responded to by Patrick Brooks at Rutgers. Will's talk today is called Epistemic Democracy and Its Enemies. Will, I have known for quite some time now. I've had the great pleasure of meeting both Will and Pat in Amsterdam last year as part of the second international conference of the philosophy of conspiracy theories, which I helped co-run with Milena Sapos and Julia Dutz. Will did his PhD through Pitzer College under the aegis of a friend of mine, Brian L. Keeley. Will, Pat, and I all have a shared interest in conspiracy theories, but today Will is broadening the scope of our interest in conspiracy theories and the like, and looking at epistemic democracy and its enemies. So, Will, I'd like you to take it away, please.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Em, for inviting me, and thanks to Beijing Normal University at Zhuhai for hosting the talk, and thanks to Patrick for agreeing to respond to this, and thanks to everybody who's here to watch this. I made a very exciting topic title, but I'm not so sure the topic itself is quite as exciting. It's a little jargony, so try to bear with me as much as possible. So I'm going to be talking about a relatively new approach in political philosophy, which is called epistemic democracy. And so in this presentation, I'm going to discuss democratic legitimacy, a few epistemic theories of democracy, and some practical and theoretical challenges to those epistemic theories. I think that the two theories that ultimately are going to do the best job of navigating theoretical challenges are Fabienne Peters' pure epistemic proceduralism and Robert Talise's Peircean epistemic defense. What I'll be looking at later is how these two theories deal with practical challenges of misinformation and hate speech, the enemies of democracy, epistemic democracy. Ultimately, I think both of these theories are somewhat insufficient, but I think maybe the Peircean view has a slightly stronger case. There we go. I'm already one slide behind. Here we go. So defining democracy is a little bit more complicated than it looks. I think most people would describe democracy as majority rule based on voting, but there are so many different theoretical approaches to democracy that majority rule isn't necessarily the best way to describe it. And voting is part of the process, but not necessarily even the most essential part. I think the most fundamental aspect of democracy that you find more or less across all democratic theories is a commitment that all citizens ought to be treated equally and have freedom. So freedom and equality are the two fundamental concepts to any approach to democratic theory. Voting and majority rule are ways in which to respect the freedom and equality of individual citizens. For example, saying one person has one vote is a way of respecting political equality, and saying that everybody can vote how they want respects personal freedom. So starting from this fundamental position that all citizens are equal and ought to have political freedom leads to one of the central questions in democratic theory, which is how to justify the use of coercive state power. In other words, we want to maximize human freedom, but the state has an interest in imposing laws that limit freedom. And these laws are determined through this democratic process. So on the one hand, freedom to participate in the democratic process is the freedom of self-determination. But as is the case in most democratic elections, nearly half of the population loses, which means the majority will always impose coercive laws, not just on themselves, but on the losing side. So the question in part is, why are laws that I don't agree to legitimate? Why should I follow laws that I voted against or I didn't vote for at all? Now, classical liberal theories, like with John Locke, explain that coercive power is legitimate based on consent of the people. However, a drawback to this view and consent views in general is that the losing side isn't exactly giving their consent to those laws. Contemporary political theory is tilted towards the idea that political power requires at least public justification, which means citizens offering reasons in public in support of these democratic policies or the elected officials. Behind one slide, one more time. Theories that define political justifications through this public exchange of reasons generally fall into the category of deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy can be put in contrast with like aggregative or proceduralist democracy, which are more concerned with basic procedures like voting and just tallying up those votes. Deliberative democracy is a normative approach that emphasizes the importance of reciprocity of reason exchange between citizens. Deliberative Democrats view decisions made through this democratic process of deliberation as legitimate if each citizen has equal opportunity to participate in the debate and their reasons are given equal consideration. So if democracy and democratic outcomes are justified through the exchange of reasons, those reasons ideally should be acceptable to everyone participating in the debate. So in other words, if we offer reasons that other people can't see as reasons, then we might as well not be offering any reasons at all. So in deliberative democracy, we share reasons with one another to engage each other as political and epistemic equals. And so to some extent, the reasons that we offer need to be acceptable, reasonable to other people. Even if they do not actually agree with those reasons, they have to be able to engage with the reasons. However, under democratic conditions, society will likely lead to a growing plurality of comprehensive doctrines, a variety of different and conflicting worldviews. This is what John Rawls, the famous Harvard political philosopher, calls the fact of reasonable pluralism. And this fact creates a challenge for democratic justification. If reasons stemming from one worldview provide the justification for some coercive law, then those people who do not share that worldview can reasonably reject this justificatory basis for the law and therefore reject the law itself. So in other words, if I'm a Christian and I use the Bible as the justification for some law I want to see enacted, other people who don't share my religious worldview will reject, right? Reasonably reject my reasoning. And if the law is created based on my particular religious reasoning, then other people might simply reject the law itself. So Rawls offers a way to mitigate this problem, arguing that people ought to deliberate using what he calls public reasons, reasons that everybody can reasonably accept. So public reasons are reasons that do not directly rely on the truth of any worldview. And by removing truth from deliberation, he says that the debate will stay on the surface, where people can find an overlapping consensus and a wider agreement. This avoids the problem of any one group imposing an oppressive worldview on others. However, the drawback to public reason is that many who want to participate in this deliberative process are actually excluded from the debate because they're either unable to separate their real, truth-based reasons from public reasons, right? They can't translate their truth reasons into public reasons, or they only have truth-based reasons, and those reasons just don't meet the public reason standard. So Rawls has introduced the fact of reasonable pluralism, right? This problem, this challenge. However, he's been criticized for not even meeting his own criteria, because his theory of political liberalism is itself a worldview that imposes rules of democratic deliberation, but outside of the democratic process. They're undemocratic. So the requirement of public reasons can be reasonably rejected. And I apologize for Rawls's terminology about we're offering reasons and they have to be reasonable reasons. It can be very confusing. So the terminology here is very confusing, but just sort of clarify what I want you to walk away with here is reasonable pluralism is the fact that there are a lot of different worldviews And if we're going to create a theory of democracy that imposes rules or limitations on democratic debate, those rules shouldn't be something that can be reasonably rejected. Again, the point here is not to undemocratically impose limits on democratic debate, because that silences voices and that threatens the freedom and equality of democratic citizens. What you should also notice here is that Rawls is asking us specifically to not use truth in democratic deliberation. He's asking us instead to use reasons that other people can reasonably accept. In other words, the kind of reason to offer is one that's reasonable, not one that's true. So Joshua Cohen, another Harvard philosopher, points out that even though Rawls is trying to remove truth from the debate, ultimately this idea of reasonableness ends up bringing truth back in anyway, since the argument is now what sort of reason is the most reasonable. And so it's either going to, right, it's true that one reason is more reasonable than another. So Cohen just reintroduces truth back into democratic theory in this essay in the 1980s called An Epistemic Conception of Democracy. Okay. Excuse me. So there in this essay, he formalizes a distinct epistemic approach and argues that an epistemic conception of democracy will need some sort of objective standard for democratic decisions that's independent of the democratic procedure. His point is that Rawls is already using an independent standard, which is reasonableness, and Cohen wants to replace reasonableness with something like truth or a common good or a general will. So essentially, Cohen is saying two things. First, you can't keep truth out of the debate, so you might as well embrace it. And second, why should the goal of democratic deliberation be reasonable answers when the goal really ought to be finding the best answers to social problems? We really ought to harness the epistemic power of group decision making. This initiates what's now referred to as the epistemic turn in deliberative democracy. Okay, so before I discuss a couple of epistemic theories of democracy, I want to introduce an important distinction, which is also really like sort of the main debate going on in epistemic democracy, maybe not, maybe democratic theory as a whole. The distinctions between procedural theories and instrumental theories. So an instrumental theory is a theory that says democratic deliberation leads to some sort of important good outcome. And it's the outcome that justifies this democratic process. Procedural theories, on the other hand, argue that it's the fairness inherent in the procedure, regardless of the outcome, that justifies democracy. So, for example, a purely procedural view of democracy comes from Joseph Schumpeter, who argues for this very minimal conception of democracy as a fair procedure, allowing one person, one vote. He says, whatever the outcome of that procedure, it's a legitimate outcome because that's a fair procedure. Now, an objection to this point of view is that fair procedures could lead to unfair or unequal outcomes. So instrumental theories argue that democracy is legitimate if the outcomes are good. Now, the drawback to this view is it kind of runs afoul of reasonable pluralism. In other words, who determines what makes an outcome a good one? And there are also mixed approaches. Like Rawls, for example, is asking for a fair procedure where everyone offers public reasons, but the goal is to create this outcome of group consensus. So there are purely procedural, purely instrumental, and then all sorts of mixed approaches. Okay, so let me talk about several epistemic theories. A lot of the early and maybe the most well-known theories of epistemic democracy are instrumental theories, sometimes called correctness approaches. These approaches argue that large groups are capable of making good decisions. I realize when we look at actual democracies today, the idea that large groups of people making good decisions sounds very counterintuitive. Usually we're warned against groupthink or mob mentality. And frankly, looking at politics in the United States recently, it does not appear that large groups are making good choices. However, there are some statisticians who have made some interesting mathematical discoveries about group deliberation, and those theories, the theorems, have been integrated into democratic approaches. So the Condorcet jury theorem says that when voters have at least two options, they vote based on their best judgment, and they're correct at least more than half the time, so 51% of the time. Then the larger the group involved in the deliberation, the more accurate the group is in finding correct answers. So epistemic approaches to democracy that utilize the Condorcet jury theorem argue that democracy, and specifically large groups engaging in this deliberation, create the best solutions to social problems. And this justifies the democratic process. Likewise, there's a theorem called the diversity trumps ability theorem, which explains that there may be some individuals that can solve problems better than other individuals, but large groups of diverse thinkers are even better at problem solving than individuals. So while the Condorcet theory is saying that large groups of people are good at finding correct answers, the diversity theory is saying that large and diverse groups of thinkers are good at finding correct answers. Now, these theories offer a compelling argument for group decision making, but I think that they're probably taking a major step backwards within democratic theory. So these theories are relying on an independent standard of truth, but I think that standard can be reasonably rejected. And lots of people have made this argument. If I know correct answer to a problem, then when large and diverse groups deliberate and they reach their answer, I can compare their answer to the correct answer. Okay, like if I'm a teacher and I know the answer, and my students deliberate and they come to a correct answer, I know it and they've done a good job. However, if we, in a democratic situation, if we already know what the truth is, then why do we need a collective decision-making process to figure it out? And if we don't know what the truth is, then how do we know that this collective decision-making process reaches the truth? So I think these approaches offer an unsolvable dilemma. Either the theory imposes an independent standard of truth, or the theory says, whatever the outcome of deliberation, whatever that outcome is, that is the true answer. In either case, truth is being imposed on citizens. So in the first case, who sets the independent standard that the democratic process is judged by? In the second case, if democratic deliberation leads to answers that we all have to accept as the truth, then what about people who simply disagree or have alternative truths? They're forced to defer to an answer as correct and true, but it affirms a view of truth that people can reasonably reject. So ultimately, I don't think purely instrumental epistemic theories of democracy are going to be able to pass this challenge of reasonable pluralism. Okay, so now there are epistemic proceduralist positions. David Esselin and Fabian Peter offer two of them. So Esselin creates a theory that he calls epistemic proceduralism. This mixes together the procedural fairness component and the rational outcomes that group decision-making can create. He's trying to walk a very fine line. He says that democratic outcomes are legitimate if the process is fair and the outcomes are good. He wants both. He says that democracy is fair in its procedures if everyone has equal access to deliberation and everyone has an equal vote. He says that democratic outcomes are good, but he also doesn't use an independent standard to measure the correctness or the goodness of those outcomes. He says democracy is like a jury in a courtroom. It's a fair procedure because everyone gets to share their reasons equally and the jury is unbiased, and juries are likely to reach the correct decision, but they don't always reach the correct decision. Excuse me. So in other words, juries are likely or reliably good at reaching correct decisions, but the legitimacy of the decision is in the fairness of the procedure, not in the correctness of the outcome. He says if we just want fairness, we should flip a coin. But that doesn't guarantee good answers. If we want good answers, then we should only be asking experts. But that isn't fair and it's undemocratic. So in his jury model, juries are fair and more likely to get good answers than flipping a coin. So I think this is a pretty nice way of balancing procedures and correct outcomes. But nonetheless, Esselin's been criticized for sneaking in an independent standard, even though he's explicitly trying not to. So when asked how we know that juries are in fact reliably coming to good decisions, even if they aren't always doing it, he says it's not because they're reaching a common good, but because they're avoiding a common bad. So his independent standard is avoiding a common bad, which is less oppressive than imposing a common good, but nonetheless is an independent standard that could be reasonably rejected. Or so the argument goes. So this is why Fabienne Peter argues for what she calls pure epistemic proceduralism. She says that any instrumental conception of democracy, even Esselin's mixed approach, can be reasonably rejected. She argues that freedom and equality must be understood as purely procedural values. Her view isn't simply that freedom and equality are important moral values. She's arguing that they are epistemically important values as well. So she's arguing that a fair and equal participation in democratic deliberation is epistemically valuable because it allows large and diverse groups of individuals to add their voices to the debate, which increases the knowledge-producing potential of democracy. Not that it does lead to democracy, just that it can. Her position is that inclusive and diverse debate will filter out bad reasons and allow good reasons to flourish. Her point is that fair procedures, if truly fair, will lead to epistemically valuable outcomes. But her point is that the outcomes don't justify the procedure. I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes. There are also pragmatist approaches. So pragmatism is a uniquely American school of thought that started around the turn of the 20th century. The three most famous classical pragmatists are Charles Saunders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. Now, Dewey is the only one of the three who made a clear epistemic argument for democracy, but currently there are at least two pragmatist approaches to epistemic democracy, at least the two most, I think, discussed ones. One is based on Peirce, and the other is based on Dewey. So there are several Deweyan approaches and lots of different Deweyan theorists. So Elizabeth Anderson, Philip Kitcher, and Hilary Putnam are a few examples. The Deweyan approach is also a mixed approach. It also asserts that democratic deliberation can reach good answers, but it doesn't have an independent standard for correctness. So in the Deweyan approach, answers to social problems are constructed through the process of deliberation rather than deliberation somehow like uncovering true or correct answers. One challenge to some of these instrumentalist theories is that deliberation may reach correct answers, but who's constructing the questions, right? Who sets the problem? So in the Deweyan approach, deliberation both constructs problems and constructs answers. So there's no independent standard outside of the deliberative process. The Deweyan approach is experimental. Democracy is a place to test out hypotheses. Citizens discuss remedies to social problems and then test out those solutions. When those solutions fail, democracy provides a system that offers remedies and offers for the revision of procedures and policies. This is a very dynamic and creative view of what democracy does. Democracy is both the means and the end. So in an important sense, the Deweyan approach is neither procedural nor instrumental because the deliberative process is both constructing and revising procedures and constructing and revising outcomes at the same time. Now, in John Dewey's writings, he describes this view of democracy not just as something we participate in, but as a way of life that extends through all aspects of social and ethical life. He says, quote, right, It's a form of government because it's a form of moral and spiritual association. So Dewey's explanation of epistemic democracy comes across as a worldview in and of itself. And so there's been a lot of pushback against that view as a comprehensive doctrine, and that being incompatible with reasonable pluralism. Now, whether some of the contemporary Deweyan approaches fall to the same objection is sort of up for debate. It's a raging debate in pragmatist philosophy, but I'm not going to adjudicate that debate here. An alternative pragmatist approach is the Peircean epistemic defense. This is coming from Cheryl Missack and Robert Talisse, who based their theory on an essay that Charles Saunders Peirce wrote called How to Make Our Ideas Clear. In that essay, Peirce explains that belief involves a process of inquiry. If somebody holds a belief, then that is to say somebody believes that they have a true belief. This isn't to say that when people believe they always have the best reasons to believe, they do have true beliefs, or they're relying on the best evidence. But when people say they believe something, they take it that they have the best reasons to believe. They take it that they are holding a true belief. But in order to hold a true belief, we have to offer reasons that support that belief. And we have to test our reasons out with other people. We have to deal with counterarguments. We have to deal with opposing evidence. So belief in the Peircean sense is a public process. We certainly can't think we have a true belief if we have no reasons to defend that belief. We certainly can't think we have a true belief if there's better evidence that points against it. For us to justify our beliefs, we have to assert a belief to other people and engage in a process of reason exchange. And we have to be willing to modify that belief when we're presented with counter evidence and contrary reasons. So Talisse argues that the social process of creating a belief requires a democratic system. He says that only in a democracy that protects freedom of speech and press and association, et cetera, only that sort of system can provide the epistemic environment required to create true beliefs. So in other words, if I live in a society that is full of state propaganda and I'm not allowed to get access to good information, then I'm not allowed to, if I'm not allowed to share my reasons, or if other people aren't allowed to openly share their reasons, then I'm not in a position where I can justify the truth of my belief. So we need a democratic system. So this is an epistemic approach that's also a mixed approach because it requires fair and equal procedures. Everyone needs equal access to deliberate, to test their beliefs, right? But it's also an instrumental theory because the deliberative process leads us to true beliefs. However, there's no independent standard here because each person is striving for their own conception of a true belief. So the Peircean view abandons an independent standard and replaces it with this sort of causal efficacy. Democracy is justified because it's good at allowing me to inquire and create my true beliefs. Okay, let me sort of recenter what the debate's all about here. So I've covered a few of these major approaches to democratic epistemic democracy. We can see that there are purely instrumental approaches, which is the Condorcet and the diversity theories. There are purely procedural approaches like Peter's pure epistemic proceduralism. And then there's these mixed approaches, Dewey, Peirce, and Esland. So from a theoretical point of view, the fact of reasonable pluralism is, I think, the biggest challenge to these theories, to all of them, and specifically the issue of the procedure independent standard, which I've discussed so far. It imposes a judgment of what is true or what counts as good or the good life or the common good. But these independent standards can be reasonably rejected because they're not developed democratically in some of these theories. So in my view, the two well-developed approaches that are best dealing with the fact of reasonable pluralism are going to be Peter's pure epistemic proceduralism and the Peircean epistemic defense. Neither of these views are concerned with the common good as an outcome of democratic deliberation, and yet both views are still committed to an epistemic value to deliberation. Peter argues that fair procedures will create outcomes that have epistemic value, and the Peircean view argues that democratic deliberation is at least necessary to create good beliefs, even if it doesn't actually always do that. So in both cases, democratic deliberation is fair, and it does something epistemically useful and valuable. So I'd like to add a dimension to this debate, drawing from another discussion in political theory between ideal and non-ideal theory. I don't really have time, obviously, to get into any meaningful detail here about that debate, but essentially a great deal of democratic theory, including pretty much everything we've talked about today, comes from the point of view of ideal theory. So ideal theories assume a certain idealized level of like rationality and epistemic ability of citizens, much more so than the reality of actual people in actual democracies. Ideal theories abstract from actual social realities to help create a model of democracy that actual democracies can strive towards, even though they're unlikely, maybe impossible to actually reach them. Now, proponents of non-ideal theory are critical of ideal theory since they're arguing essentially what's the point of a theory of democracy if that theory can't be realized? One example here is like Charles Mills, who's thoroughly criticized ideal theory, and Rawls in particular, for ignoring social inequalities of racism and sexism and poverty that are so widespread in actual democracies. I think it's appropriate to apply this non-ideal dimension here because really one of the best benefits to both deliberative and epistemic approaches to democracy is how they're being integrated with real political action. For example, in the use of like citizen committees and deliberative mini publics to solve real social problems. So this isn't a random application of a different dimension of a different debate. I think it's really important. So I take it that pure epistemic proceduralism and the Peircean view are superior approaches insofar as they do the best in dealing with the theoretical challenge of reasonable pluralism. So I'd like to suggest taking these two ideal theories and see how well they stand up to non-ideal considerations that are really plaguing, actual democracies today. So misinformation and hate speech are a threat to both the fairness of procedures and the epistemic quality of deliberation. So I think non-ideal real-life concerns need to play a role here in adjudicating this debate. I'm using the word misinformation to cover a lot of things. That it's not an accurate way of using that word. Maybe disinformation is a better word, and so I'm just wrapping them all together. False reasoning under the banner of misinformation. So give me a little leeway with that one. So misinformation can threaten the epistemic function of democracy and harm democratic legitimacy by polluting the cognitive environment of democracy. This pollution can occur in at least three ways. First, misinformation can interfere with this truth tracking function of democracy. False or misleading information can impede the ability for citizens to make epistemically good decisions in their own favor. Second, misinformation can cause skepticism and distrust of experts and democratic institutions. Third, misinformation can result in real harm. For example, climate denialism or anti-vaccination misinformation. Hate speech, additionally, is a unique problem for democratic society and legitimacy because of the way it harms the freedom and equality of politically and socially marginalized citizens in both epistemic and moral ways, right? When hate speech is applied to people, it can reduce their standing as citizens. So how can epistemic theories, particularly these two, respond to misinformation and hate speech? So for Peter, it appears as though there's going to be some imposition of limits to meet the conditions of fair procedures. I mean, this is just I'm just taking a guess here. The epistemic problems caused by misinformation and hate speech seem to require that misinformation be limited to ensure the conditions of epistemic fairness are met. In other words, if misinformation and hate speech make it so citizens cannot participate equally insofar as they don't have the requisite information necessary to deliberate in their own interest, or they lack equal epistemic standing, so that they're not able to effectively participate in the debate, then there appears to be a justification for the state to suppress cases of misinformation or hate speech. But with any case of state intervention, right, to limit free speech, there is a direct threat to democratic legitimacy, since state suppression of speech silences democratic voices. The alternative to state suppression is for Peter to explain why allowing misinformation or hate speech can result in fair deliberation and epistemically valuable outcomes. So she suggests that excuse me, a truly fair procedure will eradicate actual inequalities, such as sexism, since women with equal political power will vote against sexist policies. She says specifically, quote, if the procedure is genuinely fair, one would thus not expect a sexist proposal to go through. Conversely, if a sexist proposal goes through, is this not likely to be the result of unfair procedures? End of quote. So, in other words, the inclusion of biases, such as sexist views, can be countered by the inclusion of feminist biases. And thus, bias ends up eliminating or canceling out other bias. So, that's her response. However, I have a hard time seeing how, in actual democracies that are already under conditions of social inequality and thus already lack sufficiently fair procedures, I don't see how these societies will then create fair procedures. Assuming fair procedures will lead to fair outcomes is one thing, but starting from a position of inequality, it's unclear how to create fair procedures without imposing those procedures in some undemocratic way. My assumption is that Peter would respond that as an ideal theory, this is just a goal to strive towards, right? We ought to work towards creating conditions that entail fair procedures. But from the point of view of non-ideal concerns, I don't see how to avoid imposing undemocratically conditions that allow for fair procedures. If Peter is suggesting that equal rights by themselves will eventually lead to fair procedures and outcomes, that just appears overly optimistic. So my hope is that open dialogue will lead to social equality, but I don't think that that's guaranteed. The Peircean view argues that due to our personal commitment to proper believing, this entails a commitment to democracy. So we have a personal commitment to fair procedures and the equality of other citizens. So in other words, we ought not to share misinformation or hate speech, since those sorts of reasons undercut the ability of other people to participate equally in the debate. And if other people are not our epistemic equals, then that means we can't test our reasons with those people and we can't create our own true beliefs. Excuse me. The non-ideal challenge here is against the Peircean view is ironically pragmatic. The Peircean argues that we need a society full of free and equal citizens so that we can test our belief and respond to their counter-arguments. So there's a pragmatic need for free and equal citizenship for others that we already hold as a requirement for our own beliefs. But if these are commitments that we all already hold, why don't we already affirm the freedom and equality of others? In other words, this pragmatist proposal comes across very unpragmatic. It's unrealistic to expect citizens to actually treat each other well for truth's sake. Maybe I'm being overly pessimistic all around here, but this just maybe is an overestimation. I think Talise might just be overestimating people's priorities. I mean, certainly philosophers are committed to truth. That's literally our job. But I don't take it that the populace at large is all that committed to true believing. even if people do claim to hold true beliefs. I worry that people are more concerned about feeling like they are right and have true beliefs rather than that they're actually going out there and doing the hard work of engaging with people different than themselves to test those beliefs. So both Peter's pure epistemic proceduralism and the Peircean view offer positions that are, I think, overly optimistic about either the ability for free debate to lead to a fair society or that we are individually committed to the freedom and equality of others by way of our own beliefs, our own commitment to truth. Between the two views, I'm inclined to think that the Peircean view offers a better approach to epistemic democracy because the commitment to democracy and the need to eliminate social inequalities comes from self-interest, which just seems to track a little bit better with human behavior than Peter's argument that open deliberation will like somehow progressively create fair procedures and eliminate social inequalities. And that's the end of my talk. So thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Will. I will I will clap on microphone and on camera. Applaud you in their own way, whether they want to use the reaction, which you'll find at the very bottom of your Zoom screen, or just type something in the chat, or just clap along at home. Okay, that was a great talk, Will. We're now going to have a response from Patrick Brooks. Pat, do you have slides, or are you just directing yourself directly towards camera?
Nope, I'm just gonna talk.
Then you have the floor. Please take it away.
For how long should I talk? I don't have a ton of stuff to say, but
15, 20 minutes. I mean,
we'll see if we get there. And Will, please feel free to respond to some of the stuff I'm about to say. Okay, so overall, great presentation. I really liked it a lot. I like the draft that you sent me. Very good. A big picture thing. So I like the amount of background that you gave, but I wonder whether it's strictly necessary to motivate your thesis. So as I was reading, I was feeling like it's very like a Phil Compassy type article where like, hey, here's the lay of the land, which is great because we need those articles. But then like when we got to the end with the misinformation and hate speech stuff, it all went by very quickly. And I think I would have liked to have seen the paper structured a bit more. Here's Fabian Peters' view. Here's Bob Talisa's view. Here's where hate speech and misinformation pose a problem to this. Let's get into the specifics of these views and see what they say. I think that would have been, I mean, it's another way to write the paper. And I just think it would have been, I would have liked to have seen more about that. I know you're already at like 8,500 words. So, we do what we must. So that's like, that's a big picture thing. Moving on to like another thing, and then I'll have some comments about the actual talk you just gave too, with the slides and whatnot. So I think it would be really helpful to further elucidate what the it is that deliberative democracy is supposed to get right. Like if democracy, especially deliberative democracy, aims at truth, what kinds of truths are we aiming at? It seems to me like it's not something as anodyne as snow is white, or it's not something like the defendant's not guilty. But it seems like the sort of the real meaty things that democracies are meant to do, and maybe this is just my sort of background commitments coming out, is to say like, given what we know and what we want, such and such policy will lead to the best outcomes, and so we ought to implement that policy. That seems like the proper output of a deliberative democratic process. And that seems altogether different than something like snow is white, or something like the defendant's not guilty. And it seems like there's a number of places here where an independent standard is kind of required just to get things going, right? Because it seems like there's a bunch of ways we could go wrong. We could be wrong collectively about the facts. given what we know bit. We could be wrong about that, and I think that's where like misinformation and hate speech are going to play a big role, right? If all you have is a bunch of nonsense from your epistemic bubble, then how are you meant to deliberate? Because you don't have the right facts. So it's garbage in, garbage out. We could also be wrong about the perceived outcomes of implementing the policy. So we could think we ought to do such and such, given what we know, what we want. And everybody goes, yeah, we've thought about it. That's what we should do. And it could turn out that that goes bad, like in the Dewey way, right? It's a hypothesis. It generates testable predictions. We can implement it and see whether it works. So we can be wrong about that. And that seems like it's, so there's a standard about the facts, right? This correspondence with reality, or coherence if you want to be full pragmatist about it. And there's going to be a sort of a fact of the matter about whether the outcome did what we wanted it to. It seems like we can also be wrong about whether implementing the policy is the thing to do. So it could have the outcomes we want. We could be right about the facts, but it could also have like unintended consequences that we didn't foresee, right? Some sort of X risky type stuff or whatever. And so while the policy worked and we were right about what we wanted in the facts, we were sort of, there were unknown unknowns for which we didn't account. And I think that's sort of something that's going to have to be adjudicated by some independent standard. I think we could also be wrong about the things we want by our own lights, right? We could be misunderstanding our comprehensive doctrine, as it were. And again, that seems like that's going to be with respect to some standard. And then finally, so I think the contentious thing is that we could just be wrong about the things we want simpliciter, right? By something that's like external to our comprehensive doctrine or our paradigm or our worldview, we could just have the wrong worldview. And I think that strikes me as the target of Rawls' reasonable pluralism stuff. So I think it would be worth in the paper, or maybe just here for my benefit, just talking a bit about when we're worried about an independent standard, like when we have to have it, when we can chuck it out, when we should be worried about it. Because it seems like, looking through the paper, you have all these sort of like these like 5 problems for epistemic theories, and one of which is like, truth is anti-democratic. And it seems to me like it's not anti-democratic with respect to all these kinds of truth, or all these things we're worried about being true. You don't want to say like, I think some crazy thing, and you're like, well, you're wrong about that. And be like, that's anti-democratic. That seems no good, right? So I think it'd be worth really getting in the weeds maybe about some of this truthy stuff. And then I think it'll help maybe sort of sharpen the question, which is which of these things are sort of the proper object of reasonable pluralism, and on which of these things do these sort of non-ideal considerations that you're concerned with press the most? Because I think those are both interesting questions. Yeah, so there's that. I think so. Let's see what else. So I think, like, I hate to be this guy, and you said in a caveat that you're using misinformation like a loosey-goosey kind of way, but I think it's really important to say what you mean by misinformation and hate speech in as clear a way as possible. Or maybe here's another possibility. You could say misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, whatever they are, undermine democracy, and just really skirt the question. And here's what I'm thinking. If you say like, oh, well, Trump, blah, 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 misinformation, or Harris, blah, 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 misinformation, that immediately is going to, undermine everybody who can reasonably reject that view, right? And you don't want like, Dan Williams and Joe Uzinski and a bunch of other people have written about misinformation not being the kind of thing that you know when you see it. Whether something's misinformation is going to depend on some level on your background, whether you see it that way or not. And so anytime the state comes in and says, no, no, not this stuff. This other stuff's fine, but no, no to this. It's just unclear by what standard they're going to be judging that. So you can skirt that question and say, look, falsity in general is no good for democracy, because in order to deliberate, we need to have a shared set of facts. We need to be operating on the same body of evidence. And to the extent that falsity muddies the waters, that's going to be a big problem. And then you can say, maybe sort of get around that worry. I'm interested to hear what you think about that. And I think the same thing's going to be true with hate speech. There's clear cases. I think there's things that like everybody can agree, like that's no good. But then there's going to be fuzzy stuff at the margins that whether you consider it hate speech or not, it's going to depend in part upon your background beliefs and commitments. You might think it's not great to say, but you might think that it falls short of hate speech. Okay, so that's sort of like my comments from just having read the stuff, read your paper. With respect to with the talk you just gave, which had a little bit different stuff in it, or made me think of some additional things. I wonder, like, so the criticism of Rawls is like, well, this is just a comprehensive doctrine too, and you're sort of importing other stuff. I guess, like, isn't it worldviews all the way down? Like, isn't this just inescapable? Like, it seems like whatever sort of set of justifications we try to give for our political system is just going to sort of bottom out in worldviews, right? Like, it's a worldview that we think fairness and equality matter. And it's a relatively recent one, for the majority of human history, the worldviews were such that those things were, we wouldn't even thought about that. It's the same way in which, like, we now value forgiveness in a way that our distant ancestors would not have understood at all. This is one of the things that, people talk about Christianity a lot with, is just like, before this religion became big, forgiveness wasn't a thing that we were really concerned about. And now it is. And it seems anathema to suppose that anybody wouldn't be, but nevertheless, they were for a long time. Probably the same thing with freedom and equality. So that's worldview stuff too. So we're smuggling that in, you might say. A quick point on the Condorcet stuff. That's, and I think with respect to like the how do we know it works, if we already know the truth, we don't need it. And if we don't know the truth, how do we know we got to it? Well, it seems like the Condorcet person could say, well, we can do Condorcet jury theorem stuff for things we do know the answer to and find that people reliably produce the right answer that we knew. And so probably we can think that we'll do that with stuff that we don't know the answer to also. A bigger problem with the Condorcet stuff, and I think that this is worth harping on maybe, is it requires that we're independent, that the jurors are independent of one another, and they just never are. Like, and you see the same problem with consensus in science, which I'm sure Steve would have something to say about. Like, if you get a consensus derived independently, that's great. But if somebody's like, well, you should believe that P because that's the consensus, if the consensus was sort of coerced, or you have to believe that in order to publish, or you can't say that not P because people are going to get mad at you, then that's not a real consensus, right? That's not independent. It's the same with the sort of Hume on miracles stuff. So if you want to complain about the Condorcet stuff, I would suspect that's the place to push. Let's see. Again, like, I think this, like, with the Fabian Peter stuff, her idea that if there's sexist policies, having free and equal representation will sort of root those out because women will vote for the non-sexist policies. But of course, whether something counts as sexist is going to depend, again, on your background views, right? There are policies that a lot of women would say are sexist, but then there's women vote for those policies and presumably would say that they're not sexist, or they wouldn't say, yeah, they're sexist, but I like them. And so it seems like there's these standards are getting smuggled in sort of regardless of what we do, which is not a problem for you, problem for all these views, I think. And I think I would wonder, you know more about Peirce than I do, of course. But I guess I would wonder, you said Peirce has no independent standard for true belief. But I mean, Peirce or the pragmatists in general are coherentists. So your beliefs at least have to cohere. You can't just, it's not, this Quinean believe what thou wilt type thing. So there's still a standard. The standard might not be correspondence, but it's coherence, right? You had better have a coherent set of beliefs, or else, you're criticizable. I would have thought on pragmatist grounds. So again, despite that we try to escape something objective, it seems to be it's always going to sneak in somehow. And yeah, I think that's about 15 minutes, which is about what I had aimed for. So that's what I had to say. Overall, I really liked it. And I think, again, these are like not your problems. These are just problems. But I definitely think that you could, and I think a lot of these are probably well-known problems. But I would like to see in the final version of the paper just more talk about the non-ideal stuff, because I think that's really interesting. And if it could, given that these problems seem to multiply and percolate out through all the views, if it could be that, as you say in the paper, the way they deal with non-ideal stuff could be the decider, well, that would be awesome. And I would just like to see more of that. So thanks for the talk. Thanks for letting me, blabber on about it afterwards. And yeah, I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Em, you are muted.
It's true. And actually, the great thing about Zoom these days is it tells you you're muted. So you get told off by the computer and the respondent at the same time. Before Will gives his response, just a point, if you want to raise a question, you can either use the raise hand function in Zoom. So in the React panel, there is a raise hand function there that will give me an idea of who's asked questions and in which order those questions had been asked. Or you can pop a question in the chat. We already have a comment in the chat I'll read out once Will's had his chance to respond. So Will, do you have any responses to give to Pat there?
Yeah, Pat, so thank you so much for taking the time to read the paper and putting together this response. I really appreciate it. I definitely want to apologize for the length of the paper that I sent you and everything that was covered. This is the presentation today. I viewed it as a little bit more teaching about epistemic democracy rather than just like presenting a paper that I've written. So yeah, I agree. This would have been a poor paper the way it was outlined by itself. It really is actually several different papers that are stitched together. So you identified that problem immediately as you were very good at doing in the first place. So yeah, again, sorry for the really long paper on your end. I don't know where to start. You covered a ton of stuff. I agree with you that you're right that there are worldviews all the way down. I mean, I think the problem is when the difference is seeing like, is it okay to share a worldview as opposed to, is it okay to impose a worldview? And I think that's the crux of this problem, right? Is what Rawls is trying to do is remove worldviews entirely from the debate to avoid the imposition of one worldview on another, right? So he wants to get rid of all of them. He doesn't want anything there. And so he's being criticized as ultimately having a worldview, right? And you're right. This is like, we can apply everybody having a worldview. We can apply that to everything. But I think that's the point, is recognizing how many of these little requirements that political philosophers are sneaking into their theories actually represent worldviews. And so we want to be aware when we're imposing a worldview as opposed to just sharing it. So I think that's I think what Peter and Talise are doing, and I should say Misak as well. I mean, I keep saying Talise as if it's just him, but Cheryl Misak wrote this book in 2000, and Talise has basically picked up the mantle. He's done it his own way, and he's written a lot more. So I'm like, I point to him as like the main character, but I don't want to like undercut Cheryl Messak's contribution. She's the original Persian political philosopher. Um, but anyway, my point is both Peter and Mishak and Talise, they're offering views that appear like like the worldview's fine, like bring it in. Um, and they're trying to navigate how to avoid those worldviews from ultimately being imposed on others. And Talisa is saying you should just not do it yourself. Like just try, you're allowed to bring your worldview in according to my theory. I'm just saying you shouldn't do it. And so that puts the onus on us to not use our worldviews, even though in his theory he's allowing it. So it's a little bit like I don't know if weaselly is the right word. It's like he's not going to be responsible for excluding worldviews. He's saying it's our responsibility. So he's still excluding them. It's just he's rifling it through us instead of through him, right? And Peter, I think I'm not entirely sure that her view is like fleshed out enough to really understand. Because I mean, I presented it as being two options. Like if we want fair procedures, it seems like we need to impose fair procedures. But she's saying that we shouldn't be doing that. So I assume that she doesn't want that. But at the same time, I just don't know how we can arrive at fair procedures if our starting point is unfair procedures. So yeah, I know she wants to allow worldviews in so that they can use their bias to fight other biases. And I think your point about sexism and like what even is sexism? Because if there's a sexist policy and women have an equal right to vote, well, then apparently some women don't consider it a sexist policy, or it doesn't bother them, or something along those lines, right? So I don't know. In both of these cases, it sounds like they're so hands off, like let the worldviews have at it, that it's almost like an affirmation of the status quo, right? Like if Talisa is saying, "Hey, we already have these commitments," well, then I mean, I don't know. I guess we should be better at like living up to them, but like they're already there. We don't have to do anything. We just personally, democracy as a system, as an institution, doesn't have to change. We should just be better about it, right? And Peter again is saying like, just let them all have at it, and like the cream rises to the top, which is kind of what like John Stuart Mill is arguing to some extent. But she's saying it's not to get the cream, it's that like the rising part is like what's so epistemically valuable. But she's been criticized for like maybe it like she is saying procedures are going to lead to good outcomes, but it's not the outcomes that matter. It's really the procedures. But like, what if fair procedures don't lead to good outcomes? Then the theory, I don't think, works. So if you don't have the outcome component, then I don't know if the fair procedure part is sufficiently giving us these like valuable epistemic or these yeah, I mean these other epistemically valuable, like I don't know, virtues or something. So I think that needs to be worked out as well. So yeah, and I think you're lucky for you. The whole hopefully lucky for you, the whole issue about like defining misinformation and hate speech. That's a separate paper that I'm working on, but it's specifically related to conspiracy theories. So that is something I'm working on, is like to what extent is the state justified in suppressing certain conspiracy theories if they are presenting misinformation and hate speech. And I'm framing it within this problem of epistemic democracy and this issue of democratic justification. So that I have fleshed out a little bit better, but unfortunately somewhere else. So you'll have to read another long paper to get all of that information. But I think that's all I've got right now. I'll open this up.
Can I just say one thing I think that might be helpful? So there's in the philosophy of science literature, there's this paper by Kevin Zollman, and I don't remember what title it is or what's the title is, but it's this idea that you might have thought that the best way for science to progress is for everybody to be working on the most current, most up-to-date paradigm, view. But it turns out that that's false. It turns out science functions better if there's a bunch of people working on sort of different views or different theories about the same thing. And you might think that this could apply to either the Cheryl Missack, Bob Talese, Fabian Peter stuff, where like, look, yeah, we need a bunch of worldviews, in fact, because we're gonna converge on something more close to the truth if we have a bunch of worldviews. So it's less sort of agents deliberating on equal footing and more sort of sets of worldviews, sets of agents with worldviews deliberating on equal footing. If I can find that Kevin Zollman paper, I'll send it to you because I think it's all Bayesian stuff, which maybe your thing or not, but it is, I think, an interesting upshot and might apply to this stuff in a cool way where no, we need friction, right? We need disagreement. We need people who with worldviews that we think are crazy to be around because they're it's gonna eventually we'll get there. Um, so maybe that'll help, maybe not, but it's an interesting result in any case.
Okay, so if there are any questions from the chat or from the participants, please raise your hand or put them in the chat. We do have a comment that was given during the talk by CY. It seems the colliding, I can't even read English this morning. It seems the colliding of bubbles is better than everyone stuck in their bubbles. Will hate speech and misinformation exist when people actually sit down and talk to each other respectfully and rationally? The internet often blocks stuff, but once I sit down with someone, actually, I often find her or his points useful. Either of you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point. Um, and it's something that like I like about Talese's theory is that he is he is saying like for us to create true beliefs, there's also a sort of set of like virtues that we need to possess. Like we have to be open and receptive to other people's reasoning and try to understand their points of view. And again, what I like about Talese's view is that he's not imposing that, right? He's not saying you have to do this. Like this is a requirement of democracy. Like Rawls says something like that. Like there's this ethical demand of citizenship, and again, that's the type of claim that can be reasonably rejected. But Talese is saying, well, you've got to sit down and really listen to other people. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to create true beliefs. Because if you're dogmatic, if you're closed-minded, then other people's reasoning, especially like, as Patrick was talking about with like widely different, very different views. If you're closed-minded to that, you're never going to be able to develop your opinion and create, true beliefs or truer beliefs or, better beliefs at least. So I think it's great. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, pragmatically that works. Sit down and listen to other people that are different than you. It's a great comment. Thanks.
And it seems Pat Brooks in the chat largely agrees, but also worries that sometimes we might be too far apart for consensus to ever be reached. And actually, that brings me to a minor and a major point. So the minor point is, so Pat, you made the claim that kind of free equal views are kind of a modern invention as a kind of worldview. I do wonder whether that's actually slightly ahistoric, because we do have examples of people being anti-slavery all the way back in Athens. You get the Cathars or the Albigensians preaching their free love ideas and then being crushed by the Roman Catholic Church as a response. I wonder whether the issue is not such that these views are new, it's just that there's been a dominant worldview which has been very good up until recently at quashing those views. So the views have kept on appearing, but a rival worldview that's so radically apart from that one has been able to be in a position to then go, I believe in freedom and equality, but I believe in the power of the sword, and the sword cuts your freedom and equality down every single time.
Yeah, so I think that's fair enough. Probably every view has been represented at some point or another. Um, but I guess I would say that thinking of these in terms of the state is relatively new. Um, and I think that's probably enough. But yeah, I mean, fair enough. There have been,
And I mean,
anti-abolitionists and so
oh,
on and so forth.
the state here, because I mean, the Lombards were a state. They were just crushed by the church. The Cathars had their own city-state. It got crushed. So I think you kind of mean large-scale states like we have in modern polities, as opposed to, say, the states as they existed in Renaissance Italy, where your state may only represent 318 people living around a single castle with a duke.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's fair enough.
Yeah. So the more major one, because there was this interesting talk about hate speech and misinformation, and I mean maybe this is the conspiracy theory theorist in me talking here. So Pat, you were saying, look, one issue is that we probably need to get precise. What do we mean by misinformation? What do we mean by hate speech? I can see from a democratic perspective that's going to be difficult because who gets to define these terms like misinformation, conspiracy theory, and hate speech? There's going to be a sense that if we go around defining these terms, are we imposing these terms on some parts of the population? But of course, conversely, as we know from the conspiracy theory literature, when we appeal to ordinary language conceptions as what counts as misinformation, what counts as hate speech, as you alluded to, Pat, by talking about the I know it when you see it standard, which seems to be going on here. Then we get these vague, imprecise notions that can then be operationalized within a political system in such a way, well, I'm crushing this because it's a conspiracy theory. How do I know it's a conspiracy theory? Well, everybody's calling it a conspiracy theory, and that then justifies my coming in and shutting down the Department of Justice investigation into this particular political candidate because they're obviously following one of those conspiracy theories. And so I wonder whether do we just stipulate these terms, as I am wont to do, or do we actually realize that in a democracy, defining key terms is actually a very, very vexed issue? Because as soon as you are defining key terms, you're having a question of who gets the power to actually say, this is the definition we're going to use.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, because it's one of those things. It seems fine that within the academic literature we can define these things to our heart's content, but do we want to be advising governments about these things? And I mean, there is a entire growing literature now about the role of rumor and misinformation expertise in the current day, and the fact that often these experts are not coming from the academic sector, or if they are coming from the academic sector, they tend to be working for government-led or government-supported think tanks. And then the worry is, are they doing the public's role or the government's role in talking about these things in discourse? I do wonder, is there a solution, or is this just going to be a vexed issue in any political system that values a deliberative component within it?
Yeah, I'm not sure where to start there. I think that's the balancing that I've been working on is the ideal and non-ideal stuff. So I mean, when we're dealing with the non-ideal situation of actual governments being justified in suppressing speech, then it's just up in the air, right? I mean, it's like it just depends on the government whether or not I think they're justified, I suppose, in some sense. Um, like legitimacy, I think, is generally talked about in two different ways. So there's normative legitimacy, and then there's descriptive legitimacy. So normative is saying, like there's a theoretical foundation for the state having legitimate power, but descriptive is just saying whether or not people actually think the state is legitimate. So, like in the U.S. right now, there's a massive like loss of legitimacy, of descriptive legitimacy, right? From a normative perspective, if Joe Biden won the 2020 election with the most votes, and there wasn't any funny business, then he is a legitimate president. But descriptively, half the country, well, maybe less than half, but like quite a large number of people in the country don't think that he did, right? And so there's a loss of descriptive legitimacy. So, I mean, yeah, I'm not sure where to go with that answer other than what political philosophers are doing in ideal theory is in a lot of ways dealing with very different issues than non-ideal theory. So
Yeah.
trying to balance these two is just
So, so Will, what about something like this? I don't know if this would work. So there was this, there's this sense that we have that if a Republican does something wrong, and then like a Republican judge issues what we take to be a fair verdict, we're like, nice, it worked. Whereas if a Republican does something wrong and they're issued whatever verdict whatsoever by a Democratic judge, by a Democrat judge, we're like, bullshit, it's rigged, like show trial, whatever, and vice versa. So it seems like maybe part of the solution, and I think this is, I think Lippmann talks about this in Public Opinion, where like maybe what we need is sort of a bipartisan, apolitical board to make these kinds of decisions, right? It can't be the state doing it. Because if the state does it, I mean, we've just said, half the people are going to be like, well, they're just censoring the stuff that they don't like. But if the Republicans are in charge of Republican misinformation and the Democrats are in charge of Democratic misinformation and everybody's doing their job, maybe that's a way to avoid the sort of appearance of impropriety. I mean, again, like who's going to be on the board? How are we going to ensure that the board isn't captured? Whatever. Like, I think that was the same response to Lippmann stuff, way back when. But maybe something like that's what we need, sort of some independent bureau.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, just like the practical implication of something like that, like how to make something like that exist. I mean, we already have election boards, and then they get appointed by whoever's in charge, right? So like it's democracy all the way down, and democracy is like it's full of bias. There's just like it's one of the big issues here is that democracy just like can't defend itself, right? Because if you impose some limit to democratic deliberation, you're doing something undemocratic. But if democracy is just run amok, then you're going to get these unfair, unequal situations that only perpetuates the problem. So, I mean, democracy is just, it's a super flawed system. I don't know what to say, right?
I mean, maybe this is a good argument against, the Adams and Dewey school of like the solution to democracy's problems is more democracy. You're like, right. But no, maybe in some instances, the solution is no democracy.
Well, like within pragmatist philosophy, political philosophy, Richard Rorty wrote some stuff on liberal Ironism, 30 years ago, and basically said, there's no truth, like if you're liberal, you just stake out your position and just argue for it. And that's just the end of it. Just be aware as an Ironist, it's ironic, right? Like you don't have a foundation for your position, you just assert it. And that's it. And other people assert their positions, and politics is just power. And that's all it is. And so he was considered a neo-pragmatist because he, like revived pragmatism. And all of the pragmatists since him are calling themselves new pragmatists because they don't want to be lumped into the Rortian stuff. So they don't want to be neo-pragmatists, they want to be new pragmatists. And so they're trying to reintroduce, if not truth, like some objective dimension to political debate. And, there's a part of me that just goes, man, maybe Rorty had it right. Maybe we should go, maybe we should just be liberal ironists, because that's more accurate to the way, that's more non-ideal, right? Like that's how people act. Maybe we should theorize in a non-ideal approach instead of these more ideal approaches. So I don't know. Just throwing it out there.
Yeah.
mean, you could take the Ben Aranovich approach. So Ben Aranovich wrote a novel called The Also People back in the late 90s. It's part of the Doctor Who New Adventures ran. And it has this notion of a highly advanced democratic culture called the Also People, who are they govern themselves by democracy, but they have AIs overseeing every single personal interaction to verify that people are being sincere and accurate. And they can't just have one, because one AI could be biased, and they can't have two, because otherwise you might get deadlocked in a kind of polarized debate. They have three independent, contrary AIs monitoring everything. So there's a functional democracy being overseen by three all-powerful godlike machines that are guaranteeing the democracy at any given time. So maybe that's what we need. We just need some large language models out there just to be checking up on all of our assertions and claims.
Yeah, what could go wrong?
Well, so in the book, a murder occurs, and it's quite obvious the person that is claimed to be the murderer can't have done it, but all three AIs agree that is the person who did it. So it ends up being a mystery of how do you pervert the system? And it turns out you just need to bribe someone. In this case, you need to bribe two AIs, and the third one will just bow to them anyway. So yeah, the solution to democracy might be a triumvirate. I mean, that's how the Roman Republic worked for a time, and that went swimmingly.
I mean, it works right up until it didn't.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that was the Roman Republic in a nutshell. It worked right up until it didn't. Okay, any further points or questions people want to raise? Any comments on the Roman Republic? I mean, it turns out, according to most studies, men are thinking about the Roman Republic all the time.
I mean, in my case, at least, that's not false.
How many times a day do you think about the Roman Republic, Pat?
I mean, it depends on if I'm working quite a bit. Because I think it's a nice when I write political philosophy or even anything with a political tinge, I eschew modern examples because I don't want anybody to get mad at me. And I feel like no one's going to get mad at me for talking about Tiberius Gracchus.
No, well, if you were in Rome, they might do. I mean, one of the interesting things about if you've ever been to Rome and you go to the location of the former Roman Senate, there are still people delivering flowers to the site in which Julius Caesar was murdered to this day. He is still considered a local Roman hero.
I kind of love that, honestly.
There are going to be some Italians who have very firm opinions on the Gracchi and the role that the assembly played in the lead up to the fall of the Republic.
Yeah, well, just hopefully none of them are reviewer too.
It's true. True. Okay, any final closing comments? Otherwise, we can bring this to a close. All right, then I shall bring this to a close. Our next talk, which will be on the 21st of November, is going to be by Alexios Stamadas Brea. It's called Political Genealogies for Conspiracy Theories Debunked. It is a reply paper to a paper that Alexios wrote last year. So it should be a very interesting piece. But yes, we will see you hopefully in a month's time. I will click stop recording. Oh,